picture this. You've finally broken free from the psychological prison they built around you. The narcissist who once held complete control over your emotions, your decisions, your very sense of reality suddenly realizes something terrifying. You've won. But here's what Carl Jung discovered about this moment that will shock you. And what happens next might be the most dangerous phase you'll ever face. Stay with me, because by the end of this, you'll understand exactly why Carl Jung called this phenomenon the shadow's final gambit, and how recognizing it could literally save your psychological life. According to Carl Jung, there exists a pivotal moment in every narcissistic relationship dynamic that he termed the recognition of defeat. But here's what Jung discovered that most people don't realize. This moment isn't about the narcissist accepting loss. It's about them recognizing that their primary source of narcissistic supply has achieved something they believed was impossible. You've become psychologically independent. Carl Jung said, the meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. But what happens when one person transforms so completely that they're no longer susceptible to the other psychological manipulation? The narcissist realizes you've won when they can no longer trigger your emotional reactions, make you question your own reality, control your responses through guilt, shame, or fear, extract the emotional energy they desperately need to maintain their false self. But here's where Jung's insights become truly chilling. Carl Jung discovered that within every human psyche exists what he called the shadow, the collection of repressed, denied, or undeveloped aspects of the personality. For the narcissist, their shadow contains something terrifying, the truth of their own inadequacy, their deep-seated shame, and their fundamental emptiness. According to Carl Jung, when a narcissist realizes they've lost control over their primary supply source, they experience what we now understand as narcissistic injury, but Jung described it as shadow confrontation. The carefully constructed false self begins to crumble and the shadow emerges with devastating force. Jung said, one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. For the narcissist, your victory forces them into an unwanted confrontation with their darkness, and they will fight this awareness with everything they have. But wait, there's something even more disturbing that Jung observed about this process. Carl Jung identified 3 distinct stages that occur when a narcissist realizes their psychological dominance has ended. Understanding these stages could be the difference between maintaining your freedom and getting pulled back into their web of control. Stage 1. Disbelief and testing. Jung discovered that the narcissist's first response is complete disbelief. Their ego cannot accept that someone they viewed as psychologically inferior has gained the upper hand. According to Carl Jung, this triggers what he called compensatory mechanisms, desperate attempts to restore the previous dynamic. They'll test you with increasingly desperate tactics, sudden displays of vulnerability or change, escalated aggression and blame, attempts to recreate past trauma responses, love-bombing behaviors mixed with punishment. Carl Jung said, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. The narcissist senses you've claimed this privilege, and it terrifies them because it exposes their own inauthenticity. But here's what Jung warned about Stage 2 and why it's the most dangerous. Stage 2, the shadow projection intensifies. According to Carl Jung, when the narcissist can no longer maintain their psychological superiority, they enter what he termed mass shadow projection. Everything they hate about themselves, their emptiness, their shame, their inadequacy gets projected onto you with unprecedented intensity. Jung discovered that this stage is characterized by smear campaigns that seem to come from nowhere, accusations that mirror their own behavior exactly, attempts to turn others against you, gaslighting that becomes increasingly desperate and obvious. Carl Jung said, everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. The narcissist's accusations during this phase are actually a perfect map of their own psychological wounds, but they're too fragmented to see it. And then comes Stage 3, what Jung called the point of no return. Stage 3, the death of the false self. This is where Carl Jung's insights become truly profound. According to Jung, when a narcissist realizes they've definitively lost their hold over you, they face what he described as psychological death, the complete collapse of their false identity. Jung discovered that this stage manifests in one of 2 ways: complete withdrawal and narcissistic hibernation, a final explosive attempt at psychological destruction. Carl Jung said, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." The narcissist faced with this prospect will often choose to destroy rather than accept. This is when they become most dangerous, not because they're strong, but because they have nothing left to lose. But here's what Jung discovered about why your victory triggers such an extreme response. According to Carl Jung, narcissistic personality patterns develop as a defense against profound feelings of inadequacy and shame. The narcissist creates a false self, a grandiose identity that requires constant validation and control over others to maintain. Carl Jung said, "The persona is a complicated system of relations between individual consciousness and society. For the narcissist, this persona is everything. Without it, they believe they are nothing. When you were under their influence, you served as what Jung would call a mirror for their false self. Your emotional reactions, your dependency, your trauma responses, all of this reflected back to them the image of power and control they desperately needed to see. But when you've won, when you've reclaimed your psychological sovereignty, that mirror shatters. Suddenly they see not a powerful manipulator, but what Carl Jung described as the wounded child beneath the mask. Jung discovered that this moment of recognition triggers what he called existential panic, the terror of facing one's true self without defenses. And this is exactly why your victory represents such a threat. Here's what happens in their mind when they realize you've won. Carl Jung said, "Your vision becomes clear when you look into your heart. Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakens." The narcissist has spent their entire adult life looking outside for validation, control, and identity. Your psychological freedom forces them to look inside, and what they see terrifies them. According to Jung's analytical psychology, the narcissist's realization triggers several simultaneous psychological processes. 1. The persona crumbles. The carefully constructed mask of superiority begins to dissolve when it no longer has your reactions to sustain it. 2. Shadow material emerges. All the shame, inadequacy, and rage they've repressed comes flooding to the surface. 3. Thema animus rebels. Jung's concept of the inner opposite gender archetype represents the parts of themselves they've rejected. Without your compliance to project onto, they're forced to confront these dissound aspects. 4. Archetypal chaos. The fundamental patterns that govern their psyche, the hero, the victim, the controller, all begin competing for dominance simultaneously. Carl Jung discovered that this internal chaos explains why narcissists often seem to lose their minds when they realize they've lost control. They're literally experiencing what Jung called psychic fragmentation. But here's the most important thing Jung learned about this process. According to Carl Jung, narcissists don't just manipulate others. They live in what he would recognize as a distorted reality bubble. They genuinely believe their own lies, their own superiority, their own version of events. Jung called this unconscious identification with the persona. Carl Jung said, "The greatest and most important problems of life are all fundamentally insoluble. They can only be outgrown." When you outgrow your susceptibility to their manipulation, you're not just winning an argument or ending a relationship, you're shattering their entire reality. Here's what Jung observed happens when this reality bubble bursts. 1. Cognitive dissonance overload. Their mind cannot reconcile their self-image with the evidence of your independence. 2. Projection becomes desperate. They frantically try to push their internal chaos onto you, but you're no longer receiving their projections. 3. Reality testing fails. According to Jung, they may begin to question everything, not in a healthy way, but in a fragmenting way. 4. The false self dies. What Jung called ego death occurs, but unlike healthy ego death, this happens without the support of a developed authentic self. This is why Carl Jung warned that the moment of your victory could be the moment of their greatest danger to themselves and others. Carl Jung discovered something crucial about narcissistic personalities. Their psychological structure is so rigid and defensive that when it breaks, it doesn't bend, it shatters. Unlike healthy individuals who can integrate failure and loss, the narcissist psyche lacks what Jung called adaptive flexibility. According to Carl Jung, when a narcissist realizes they've been definitively defeated, several dangerous phenomena can occur. 1. Psychotic breaks. Jung observed that some individuals, when faced with the collapse of their false self, may temporarily lose contact with reality entirely. 2. Projective identification. They may desperately try to merge psychically with others to avoid facing their emptiness, becoming stalkers, or engaging in boundary violations that escalate dangerously. 3. Suicidal or homicidal ideation. Jung noted that when the false self dies without a true self to replace it, some individuals may prefer literal death to psychological authenticity. 4. Malignant regression. They may regress to earlier developmental stages, becoming childlike in their rage and revenge fantasies. Carl Jung said, "The meeting with oneself is at first the meeting with one's own shadow." For the narcissist, this meeting is so terrifying that they may choose destruction over integration. But here's what Jung discovered about how to protect yourself during this dangerous phase. According to Carl Jung, when you've achieved psychological victory over a narcissist, you're in what he called a position of dangerous strength. You've claimed your authentic power, but this very authenticity can trigger the narcissist's most primitive defenses. Carl Jung's advice for this phase was clear. 1. Maintain psychological boundaries. Jung said, "Knowing your own darkness is the best method for dealing with the darknesses of other people. Stay aware of their projection attempts without absorbing them." 2. Avoid the savior complex. According to Jung, there's a temptation to try to help them through their collapse. He warned that this is often the false self trying to reassert control through your compassion. 3. Expect escalation. Jung observed that psychological systems fight hardest just before they transform or die. The narcissist's behavior may become more extreme precisely because they're losing power. 4. Document everything. From a Jungian perspective, the narcissist's desperate acts during this phase reveal their true character more clearly than ever before. This documentation protects you and provides clarity. 5. Trust your individuation process. Jung called the journey toward authentic selfhood individuation. Your victory represents successful individuation despite their interference. Trust this process completely. But Jung made one more crucial observation about this phase that you need to understand. Carl Jung discovered that narcissistic dynamics don't exist in isolation. They're part of what he called the collective unconscious, the shared psychological patterns that influence entire communities and cultures. According to Jung, when a narcissist realizes they've lost control over you, they often try to mobilize collective unconscious forces against you. 1. Flying monkeys. Jung would recognize these as individuals who unconsciously identify with archetypal patterns like the loyal soldier or the rescuer. They become extensions of the narcissist's will without realizing it. 2. Social manipulation. The narcissist appeals to collective shadow projections, getting groups to project their own disowned darkness onto you. 3. Institutional abuse. They may try to use legal systems, workplaces, or community organizations as weapons, knowing these institutions often unconsciously support narcissistic authority patterns. Carl Jung said, "The individual has always had to struggle not to be overwhelmed by the tribe." When you've won against a narcissist, you're fighting not just them, but unconscious tribal patterns that support their type of psychological dominance. This is why Jung emphasized the importance of what comes next. According to Carl Jung, your victory over narcissistic manipulation represents what he saw as a completion of the hero's journey, the archetypal pattern of growth, challenge, transformation, and return. Carl Jung said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." By winning against the narcissist, you've not only reclaimed your authentic self, you've become what Jung called individuated. But Jung discovered that this completion phase has its own challenges. 1. Integration. You must integrate the lessons learned without becoming cynical or closed off to genuine connection. 2. Wisdom transmission. According to Jung, those who complete the hero's journey have a responsibility to help others who are still trapped. 3. Continued growth. Victory doesn't mean stagnation. Jung emphasized that individuation is a lifelong process. 4. Shadow work. Ironically, your victory may reveal aspects of your own shadow that were hidden while you were focused on survival. Carl Jung warned that the greatest danger for the victor is believing the journey is over. He said, "The meeting with oneself is at first the meeting with one's own shadow." Your victory over external manipulation now opens the door to even deeper self-discovery. What Carl Jung observed psychologically, modern neuroscience has confirmed biochemically. According to Jung's understanding of the psychoma connection, the narcissist's realization of defeat triggers what we now know are massive neurochemical changes. Jung anticipated that the narcissist's brain during this phase would be flooded with stress hormones that impair rational thinking, activation of primitive brain centers associated with survival, disruption of normal emotional regulation systems, heightened aggression and fear responses. Carl Jung said, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." From a neurochemical perspective, the narcissist's brain is literally designed to avoid this acceptance, which is why their reactions can seem so extreme and irrational. But here's what Jung understood about the victim's neurochemical changes. According to Carl Jung's holistic understanding of human psychology, your victory over narcissistic manipulation creates profound positive changes not just in your psyche, but in your entire being. Jung would recognize that successful resistance to narcissistic control triggers increased production of confidence-building neurotransmitters, strengthened neural pathways associated with self-trust, improved stress response and emotional regulation, enhanced pattern recognition and boundary-setting abilities. Carl Jung said, "Your vision becomes clear when you look into your heart." Victory over narcissistic manipulation literally clears the neurochemical fog that kept you confused and reactive. This is why Jung emphasized that your victory isn't just personal, it's archetypal, representing humanity's potential to choose authenticity over manipulation, truth over illusion, individuation over enchantment. Here's what Carl Jung discovered that might surprise you. Your victory over the narcissist isn't the end of your transformation. It's the beginning of your real life. According to Jung, when someone successfully individuates and becomes authentically themselves despite narcissistic interference, they often discover one enhanced intuition. Jung believed that overcoming manipulation develops what he called transcendent function, the ability to navigate complex psychological situations with wisdom to deeper relationships. Having experienced false connection, you now recognize and attract authentic relationships. 3. Creative expression. Jung observed that individuation often unlocks previously suppressed creative and spiritual capacities. 4. Service to others. Many people who've won against narcissistic manipulation feel called to help others who are still trapped. Carl Jung said, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." You've done this terrifying work, and the rewards are just beginning to unfold. Here's the ultimate truth that Carl Jung discovered about narcissistic relationships. They serve an unconscious but crucial function in human psychological development. According to Jung, the narcissist enters your life not as a random predator, but as what he called an unconscious teacher, someone whose manipulation forces you to develop psychological muscles you never knew you had. Carl Jung said, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." Your victory over the narcissist represents more than escape. It represents the integration of your own dissound power, your own capacity for discernment, your own ability to choose yourself over others' comfort. The narcissist's realization that you've won is really their recognition that they've completed their unconscious function in your life. They pushed you until you became unmanipulatable, and in doing so, they facilitated your individuation journey. Jung would say this is why they're so enraged when they realize you've won unconsciously. They know their purpose in your life is complete, and they're no longer needed for your growth. Carl Jung once observed, "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed." This profound insight reveals something extraordinary about your victory over narcissistic manipulation. It represents a transformation so complete that you've essentially become a different person, one who can no longer serve as narcissistic supply. Jung understood human development as an alchemical process where base psychological materials are transformed into psychological gold. Your journey from narcissistic victim to individuated being follows this same pattern. The narcissist's manipulation initially activated what Jung called your false self, a defensive persona constructed to survive psychological assault. But through the crucible of suffering and awareness, this false self eventually dissolves, revealing the authentic gold beneath. The narcissist realizes you've won when they can no longer trigger your false self. Because your false self no longer exists, you've become what Jung called individuated, whole, authentic, and psychologically sovereign. This isn't merely recovery. It's a fundamental reorganization of your psychological structure that renders you immune to manipulation tactics that once devastated you. According to Jung, this transformation reverberates through what he called the collective unconscious, that deeper layer of the psyche where humanity's shared psychological patterns reside. Your victory doesn't occur in isolation. It inspires others to claim their own authenticity, creating ripple effects of individuation that extend far beyond your personal situation. Jung believed that when one person achieves genuine individuation, it activates archetypal patterns of liberation in others. Your authentic presence becomes a catalyst, unconsciously giving others permission to question their own false selves, to challenge their own manipulative relationships, and to embark on their own journey towards psychological wholeness. This is why narcissists react with such fury to your transformation. They're not just losing their source of supply. They're witnessing something that threatens their entire worldview. Proof that authentic selfhood is possible, that their manipulative reality isn't the only option, and that genuine strength exists beyond their comprehension. Jung discovered that this level of psychological development is rare and precious. Most people remain trapped in what he called collective identities, unconscious patterns of behavior that keep them psychologically dependent and manipulable. By achieving individuation despite narcissistic interference, you've not only won your personal freedom, you've contributed to the evolution of human consciousness itself. The process requires extraordinary courage because it demands facing what Jung termed the shadow, all the rejected, denied, and suppressed aspects of yourself that the narcissist exploited. True victory means integrating these shadow elements without being destroyed by them, transforming psychological lead into gold through conscious awareness and acceptance. Your willingness to feel your authentic emotions, to trust your perceptions despite gaslighting, and to value your truth over external approval represents a level of psychological bravery that Jung considered heroic. You've chosen the difficult path of self-knowledge over the comfortable path of self-deception. The narcissist's rage at your victory is really their unconscious recognition that they've witnessed something extraordinary. A human being choosing truth over illusion, authenticity over approval, individuation over inchment. Their fury isn't just about losing control. It's about confronting their own psychological poverty in the presence of your newfound wretchedness. Jung understood that narcissists are trapped in what he called inflation, a psychological state where the ego identifies with archetypal power but lacks genuine substance. When confronted with authentic individuation, their inflated false self feels threatened because it recognizes something real that it cannot fake, manipulate, or possess. This is why they escalate their attacks when you begin to individuate. They're not just fighting to maintain control. They're fighting against the terror of recognizing their own emptiness reflected in your fullness. Their manipulation exposed by your truth. Their false self revealed by your authentic being. Carl Jung said, "Your task is not to seek for love, but merely to seek and find all the barriers within yourself that you have built against it." Your victory over the narcissist represents the dismantling of these barriers and the beginning of a life lived from your authentic center. The barriers weren't originally yours. They were installed by narcissistic manipulation through shame, fear, and false beliefs about your worth. The narcissist convinced you that love was conditional, that your value depended on their approval, and that your perceptions couldn't be trusted. These barriers protected you from further abuse, but also separated you from genuine connection. Individuation means recognizing these barriers for what they are. Protective mechanisms that serve their purpose but now limit your capacity for authentic relationship. As you dismantle them through conscious work, you discover that love isn't something you must earn or perform for. It's something you naturally embody when you're being authentically yourself. This is what happens when the narcissist realizes you've won. They're forced to confront not just their own emptiness, but your fullness. Not just their manipulation, but your truth. Not just their false self, but your authentic being. And in that confrontation, according to Jung, lies the seed of humanity's greatest hope. That authenticity will always eventually triumph over manipulation. Your victory is not just personal. It's archetypal, eternal, and absolutely unstoppable. You've activated what Jung called the self, that deeper center of personality that exists beyond ego manipulation and social conditioning. This self cannot be destroyed, controlled, or diminished by external forces because it draws its power from the deepest sources of psychological life. Jung believed that the self naturally moves toward wholeness and truth, and that any system based on deception and manipulation ultimately cannot prevail against it. Your individuation represents this eternal principle in action, the triumph of authentic being over false manipulation, of truth over illusion, of integration over fragmentation. If this resonates with your experience, if you recognize these patterns in your own life, remember this. According to Jung, your capacity to recognize narcissistic manipulation is itself evidence that you're already on the path to victory. The very fact that you can see the game means you're no longer completely trapped in it. Your individuation journey has already begun, and narcissistic manipulation, no matter how sophisticated, cannot ultimately prevent a soul determined to become authentic. Jung taught that the psyche naturally moves toward healing and wholeness when given the opportunity. Your growing awareness, your increasing ability to trust your perceptions, and your courage to value your own experience over external validation are all signs that this natural healing process is already underway. Your victory isn't just possible. According to Jung's understanding of human psychological development, it's inevitable. The self will not be denied indefinitely, and your authentic nature will ultimately assert itself regardless of the obstacles placed in its path. The narcissist's power was always an illusion sustained by your willingness to believe in it. As you individuate, that illusion dissolves, and what remains is the unshakable foundation of your authentic self, whole, sovereign, and free. Thank you so much for staying with me through this exploration. If you found value in today's discussion, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and share this video with someone who might benefit from it. And if you'd like to go a step further in supporting this work, you can now leave a super thanks below. It's a small way to say thank you, and it truly helps keep this channel going.